content. So with that, this is what we'll be using today. What you'll see is that this is through MURAL, which is a virtual collaboration tool. Imagine this as a giant whiteboard with things like sticky notes and other items that you can use for your teams. What we'd strongly recommend is there's a template version of this that we will share out after the session that will allow you to create a copy of this exact mural and then be able to use that on your own for your team so that you can modify it without worrying that you may be modifying it for everybody else that's involved. So we'll be able to share that out after the session. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and share kind of a view-only visitor link with you in the chat. And what that will allow you to do is kind of follow along with me as we're going through the session today. So I'll drop that in the chat and let me know if you can't get in using that link, but feel free to join on into our mural. The way that we've structured this is in 4 main sections. So we'll cover the process and the template overall, but then we'll do a walkthrough of sections 0, 1, and 2 today, and section 3 around prototyping and testing, which is really also that focus on assembler. We'll dive into a little bit more in our second session in this series, which will be in April. So if you've got all of your questions about assembler, feel free to add those maybe into the chat, and we can try to get back to you before the next session if your team is already there. But before we do that, we'll go over some of the other components of a design sprint. So let's start at the top, and this is your orientation as well on the left, which is really understanding how to use this template. So what you'll see is that it's really designed for a team, right? At least 2 people. And it takes about 3 hours maybe to do the entire walkthrough of the entire template. I would actually recommend you and your teams don't spend too terribly long using all of the tools in this template. Design sprints are intended to be very fast, and the goal and the result of that is that you rapidly move through some of these activities. So the timing for them may seem very short, and that's very intentional, so that you don't spend a lot of time having your team discuss a ton of things in detail and instead kind of move them into the next activity. So the goal there is really to kind of focus on answering important questions and getting feedback before you submit your final product. So with that, maybe let's talk really briefly about design sprints. So design sprints are typically split into phases. Those phases are then focused on a very specific outcome, right? Whether that's learning about your customer, understanding your challenge space, prototyping your solution, and then testing that with your users. And you'll want to make sure then to work through these phases in order. If you need to say, hey, I only meet with my team for 30 minutes at a time, that's totally fine. We'd recommend take just a couple of activities in your session and work on those together, and then do the next set of activities the next time you meet with your team. So there is no need to kind of restructure the way that you're meeting with your teams to make sure you can fit all of the activities into a specific session. Let this be very flexible for you. But make sure you are kind of thinking about starting at the top of this template and moving down, and then moving left to right through the phase blocks. We'll see that in just a second as we go through them. And when you're starting in these, you'll see a couple of different icons throughout the template to help orient your team. So anything that's got this little purple mouse cursor icon is a link. So if you click or double click on that item underneath that mouse cursor, it will take you to another external resource, giving you more information about the activity that we're covering. The little group or team icon here in red is intended for you and your team to help orient around this is an activity that the team needs to be working on. So if you want to skip activities, that's completely fine based on where your team is today, or if they come in with ideas, feel free to kind of skim through them and pick out activities that are most helpful for you. But anything that has that little team icon is an activity. Um, just a couple of quick tips for folks who maybe haven't used Mural before. Mural is intended to be a very user-friendly virtual collaboration space. So that means that moving around is as easy as clicking and dragging. Otherwise, you can use what is this little kind of zoom box and bar in the bottom corner. And what you'll see is that I can currently see kind of overlays of where everybody is looking and use this drag to zoom in and out. If you want to add sticky notes, a lot of the activities will require engagement and interaction. Simply double click anywhere in the mural and a sticky note will appear. You can then double click that sticky again to change any of the preferences on it if you want to change its shape or its color. And if you're looking to add icons and photos, which may be very helpful for some of your brainstorming or storyboarding, in the left-hand column, you'll see a little icon that looks like mountains with a sun. If you click that, that's an image option, so you can drag in any image from the World Wide Web. And 2 items above that is a little star. That's an icon, and that way you can search through this massive icon library that they have, and that will help bring in any additional images or graphics. Any quick questions before I dive into the design sprint content about kind of what we've set up for you? Okay. Let's go ahead and then talk briefly about the design sprint process. So this is what you've probably all been waiting for, all dialed in for and registered for, which is, what are we doing with design sprints? That typically is kind of a large, maybe intimidating set of words, right? What we're planning on doing is focusing on 3 phases of this process. First, research. Second, brainstorming. And then third, prototyping and testing. And then we'll talk a little bit in our second session about how to then present your work. And we've got some tools built for that as well. But let's kind of zoom in very quickly on the content specifically underneath each of these phases. So when we're looking at research, our goal here is really to understand the challenge space, right? So the 3 challenge areas that Leo mentioned for ARSF, and this is intended to give your team a really good space to dive into that space. All these challenges are very big challenges, right? So we want to give them a chance to decide on something very specific that they want to then tackle related to that challenge, because likely having them focus on the entirety of electric vehicles may be a little too broad for the team to really come up with a specific focused idea that they can then present back out. So that's our research section, right? Really picking a specific challenge statement. Brainstorming, our second phase, is focused on creating lots of ideas and then selecting out one to then develop into a prototype. So you'll see that this particular section is really focused on lots and lots of idea generation and then moving that into selection of those ideas. And depending on your team size, you may not need all of the materials and activities in this section. If you're only working with 2 students, they may come to an agreement on what solution they're very excited about, and that's great. Then you don't need some of these tools, and that's perfect. You can move them into prototyping and testing. Prototyping and testing, our final activity section, is really focused on building that prototype in assembler and then using that prototype to test with potential users, potential people that may actually want that thing in the future, and updating it based on feedback. So having that kind of circular iteration process, right? So it's not just something that the students are building and hoping takes off and is fabulous, but is instead something that they can build and be very excited about and get feedback on from other folks to make that solution better before they then submit it in. With that, any questions on these 3 phases before we talk about the specific activities in the phases? I see a question from Nadia. How long do we need for each section? Typically, I would recommend about an hour, probably no more than an hour per phase. So you can adjust that based on what your team needs or what they're coming into the competition with. Your team may already have ideas or may understand the problem space, which is why they're interested in doing this, or you've covered it in class. And that's a great opportunity for you to then maybe skip a phase and move into the next phase. And then I see a question, can students and teachers collaborate in this app? They can. So what we're seeing in this mural space is that anytime, once we send out that template link to you, as opposed to this current interface that you're seeing, up on this top right-hand corner, there will actually be a big gray button that says create a mural from this template. And that will let you make an exact copy of this mural for your team to work in, so that yes, you can edit this, you can change this, you can add in sticky notes, you can have all your students in this participating at once. So yes, absolutely, everyone can collaborate at once in this space. Any other questions on these three phases or follow-up questions to the questions I just answered before we dive into our research phase? Okay. So feel free to continue to put questions in chat. You don't need to wait for me to ask for them. I'm happy to answer them as we go through. So before we jump into our research phase, the first thing that we want to focus on is reminding everyone of the challenges, right? So this is the same prompt that is on the ARSF website for each of these three challenges, and includes the resources as well as the links to those resources that they provide on the website. So this is just a great reminder for your team. What I would recommend is, once you have built or created a copy of this template, is to delete the resources or the prompts for the challenge your team is not focusing on, right? Only leave the one you guys are focusing on. That'll just help everyone focus their attention so there aren't a lot of distractions on this page. When you're then selecting out a challenge, then we move into our research phase. And before we get there, I see a question in chat. Do we have to use this app, or can we do other things for visual thinking? Whatever you're comfortable with. We have set this up for you as a template space, so you're welcome to use this. You're welcome to use anything else. So if you're like, I meet with all of my students in person right now, I would rather do this in person with them and have this on a big whiteboard where we meet, or in a classroom that we meet in on a regular basis, you're welcome to do that as well. The intention here is just for us to provide some guidance and structure, and then you can adapt that and change that to whatever makes the most sense for you and your team. So with that, let's dive into research. Our team has selected a challenge, right? Maybe we're really excited about the future of electric vehicles, and we say, we are going to go all in on challenge 3. With that, we don't want to focus on everything related to electric vehicles. That's probably a lot. So we'll start by gathering resources, right? Gathering information. And this will be anything that they think is relevant to help create inspiration points related to this challenge. So this might be, for your high schoolers, this may be research papers, right? This may be articles or links to news sites that are talking about the future of electric vehicles. This may be images of electric vehicles or other electric modes of transportation that are interesting or engaging to your students, or even things that are very sad or distressing that are related to how electric vehicles are modernizing the way that we're looking at transportation. So this is a great place for you to have your team collect up information, right? So imagine this as the place, if you were in person, where you're going to have everyone show up to a team meeting and say, okay, where's everyone's research, right? Everyone bring me all the things that you are getting inspiration from, bring me all the things that we want to talk about. And then they drop them all in this singular location. So that's probably a pre-work activity, right? We say, okay, everyone bring all these things related to our challenge. And then this is our first time that we have a team-based activity, right? So that's individual. And then we move into a team activity. We say, now we're going to do what we like to call insights clustering, right? So an insight is something focused on real data, which is why we have them collect all their resources up based on real information, right? Not stuff that they've heard through a friend of a friend, or they maybe saw like on social media through an ad. We want them to paste in real things that they're seeing or real data. And then they're creating insights from that data. So a good example, an insight might be, most visitors at my local park use only the slide and swings. And there's always a line for the swings, right? So that's a really good insight, because while you may say people like using the park, that's not a very good insight, because there's not a lot of things that we can do or change or try to action on based on that insight, right? That's a statement. Our insight is something that tells us, ooh, I can think of ways to change the future based on that information. So if I tell you there's always a line for the swings at the park and people really like using the swings, that's a really easy way for your team to say, hey, I could change that, right? We could build more swing sets in the park, right? Or we could offer swings in different sizes. Maybe there's a line because it's only small children, and that could take some additional insights or research digging to kind of surface that next level. But the intention here is we look at all of our research, and then we have our team either in person or on this virtual collaboration space write on sticky notes insights. And they can do that from their own research. They can do that from research that other teammates have brought, but this is a great way for them to start to add in insights. And we can have insights from all of our teammates. They may want to change their Post-it color, so they can say, oh, well, I'm going to add them in orange because orange is my favorite color. So I'm going to make sure my Post-its are all orange for my insights. And what we'll notice is that some of these insights may be the same. And that's okay. That's part of the intention, is that we want to see areas there are hot spots, right? Or clusters. So I may have an insight related to electric vehicle charging up here, right? And then I may have another student who has insights related to charging stations, right? So maybe it's not about the actual chargers themselves, but maybe it's about the places where people go to charge. And then maybe I have another student who has insights about wait times for charging. All of these are around the same problem, right? These are all talking about time to charge and this new phenomenon that happens when we're talking about electric vehicles. So we then cluster all of those insights together. We say, ooh, that's a topic area where we're having a lot of the same things. That's an interesting space, right? Those are not too separate from each other. So we want to put those in a cluster. We can then, once we have all of our clusters, say, okay, we have a lot of clusters here. And that's the point at which you, as either your team leader, mentor, or you can select students or have them work together, but you pick one cluster to focus on. And I know that might seem scary a lot, especially for your students. They may say, oh, but there's so many things we could try to fix. But we want to work on one thing at a time, right? So have them pick one cluster, ideally that's got more than one or two insights in it, because that'll give you more space and your team more space to brainstorm and create great ideas in. And then we move that cluster and say, this is the cluster we're going to focus on. And then we talk about what problem specifically we're going to solve. Before I go into how might we statements, which are a little bit of a big discussion topic from clustering, any questions on this kind of initial gathering of resources and then our insights clustering? Okay, so we've had our team collect information. We've had them then pull insights out of that information. And now we're going to figure out what problem we're actually going to solve, right? We've finally done it. We're at the point where we can talk about specific problems. So looking at our insight, we may say, okay, our team is going to take on charging, right? Like charging wait times as a problem. Now we want to figure out what problem we're actually solving related to wait times. And the way that we like to do this is to pose a question to invite us to explore solutions. We use the phrase typically, how might we? Because that implies three things. One, that there are multiple ways to solve this, right? How implies that it is not a specific solution. It opens the door to a lot of types of solutions. Two, might. Might means that sometimes some of these solutions may not work. That's okay, right? That's part of our design and iteration process, is that not everything works all the time. So might implies that there may be a little bit of a learning curve, and that's okay. And then we, which is that it's a team effort, right? Design is never individual. There's always a team supporting this. So especially when you're working with your student teams, at least you and one student are working together, right? So we have at least a team collaborative effort here. So how might we is how we start all of our questions. When we look at a good example, right? This is probably a very famous example. And if anyone wants to put in chat what company or what product they think this is talking about, feel free. But there was a very famous innovator who asked the question, how might we let people carry 1,000 songs in their pocket? And this is a great how might we question, right? Because it doesn't include a specific solution. But it is very specific about what it wants the user's experience to be, right? It kind of implies this, I want people to not have to carry around 10,000 CDs to listen to all their favorite music. How do we do that, right? There's no assumption of what the solution is going to be in this kind of question. So this is a great example of a way to write a how might we question. So this is the next step after we've identified a cluster that we like, right? So if we're focusing maybe on the charging problem or charging wait times, this is a great chance for your team to then sit down and write out some options for how what might we questions. And you may only have a couple, right? How might we questions are kind of challenging to write, and that's okay, right? Not everything related to design sprints is supposed to be super easy, but this is a great chance for us to say, how might we, and then answer that question either as a team or have your individual students write different questions and then talk about them together to pick one they really love. So this is important for them to pick one that they love, because this is their problem statement, right? This is how they're going to brainstorm. This is how they're going to generate ideas. This is how they're even going to select what ideas are best meeting this challenge statement. So this is a very important step, this number 3, to really make sure the team spends some time doing and picking something that is exciting. Any questions on how might we questions? All right, feel free to keep dropping any questions you have in chat. Happy to stop and answer them. So, I see someone raised their hand. Yes, feel free to come off mute. What's your question?
Okay, thank you for your regarding problem solving. Do you think it is better to examine one variable, or is it better or more? What I mean.
It's a good question. So I'm kind of hearing, how many variables should our team be considering for the problem? Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
It's a great question. I would recommend not really any more than 3 or 5. Once you kind of are starting to consider more aspects than that, it gets very overwhelming very quickly, right? Imagine you trying to make a decision at dinner at a menu, right? As soon as your menu choices get beyond like 7 or 8, or options for the kind of protein you can put in something exceed like 3 or 4, it's very overwhelming. There's too much choice. So I'd recommend, if your team has the interest in more choice, keep them limited to 3 to 5 in terms of variables you're thinking about. Does that help?
Yes, thank you, thank you. It's so helpful for me. Thank you.
Good. Fantastic. If anyone else has other questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in chat. I can see both of those things. So I'll have you come off mute and ask your question. Great question. So we've gone through 3 steps now, right? We've had everyone collect resources, and then we've had them pull insights out of those resources, so specific things that they could work on. And then we've had them frame those areas as a problem statement to address. So now we're awesome, right? Like, we've got a problem statement, we understand the space that we're working in a little bit better. And the last thing we want to do, because we're talking about designing a solution, right, is making sure we're focused on the person we're designing for. So at this point, now we have a specific problem, right? So I can say, how might we improve the weight, or improve the charging experience for a customer, right? Or for an electric vehicle owner. Very broad problem statement, right? So that may be my problem statement. I'm going to put that over here. And I'm going to say, how might we improve that charging experience for the, the EV owner? Okay, but who is my EV owner? This is a great question. Who owns electric vehicles? Who could own electric vehicles, right? We're thinking about the future. So that may be a bigger group in the population than it currently is. And this is a great way for your team to have a little bit of fun thinking about who is using the thing that you're building, right? We've given you an example of a persona card. It's got a couple of sections here. It's asking for a name, a portrait. And when we say portrait, an image is great here. If your students want to sketch a picture of who they're building for, great. But anything that helps them visualize literally who that person is. And then a quick description of who they are. That may include things like how old are they? Where do they live? What kinds of stuff do they do in their free time? If they bought an electric vehicle, were they an early adopter? Did they buy one like the second they could get their hands on one? Or did they take some convincing to buy an electric vehicle? Do they drive really, really far distances? Or are they just commuting to and from work, maybe 50 kilometers max? And then attitudes and goals. These are important, right? And when we're looking at goals, we really want to focus on that problem statement that we have. So they may have a goal or an attitude that is directly related to this statement. So we may say, they're a parent. They don't have a lot of time. They don't like having to wait when they go on road trips with their kids to wait for their vehicle to charge, because now they have to find something to do with their children for an hour while their electric vehicle charges. That's not cool. So these are the kinds of great things to include in your attitudes and goals, because it helps really make this about a real person that you're designing for, right? And your team may say, but how do we know? Like, how do we know what kind of person this is? That's a great question. You ask people. So feel free to look on the internet for news articles. You can look for interviews. You can also ask people that you may have in your immediate circle of connections, family, friends, who are this kind of person, right? Or who embody this kind of problem. So feel free to get creative with who your persona is, but the real focus here is that we are focusing on the human that we're building for. So it's not just anybody, right? It is someone specific so that we can envision them using our solution. And with that, you're done with the research section, which is amazing.